Hello and welcome to the Financial Wellness Hour. I am your host, Hirsch, Serman, and I'm happy to have you here on WGSN-DB, the Going Solo Network, joining us. This show is for those wanting to learn more about creating financial wellness, and we're going to look at different life cycles. We're going to explore them both financially and emotionally, because your personal finances are not really about the money, but rather the emotions associated with your finances. In some of our discussion, we're going to be fairly general. We would love to hear from you and make it more relevant. So please do call in. You can reach me through my website, lifecycle.financial. That's lifecycle.financial, or you can post your questions on YouTube or Facebook or anywhere else you might be listening. Unfortunately, people are often unfamiliar with the divorce process, and they're going through this, and it's so important to their lives. And they don't even realize sometimes there might be more than one process that you can actually be following. They stress, they're scared, they don't know what the future holds. And on top of all of this, they are asked to make decisions and come to an agreement. This can be very overwhelming and very stressful. Our guest today works to help his clients develop an understanding of the process and the situation they are in, as well as skills to work through conflict and to take those skills beyond the divorce itself. Brian James worked for 10 years in the criminal justice system. He worked with people impacted by domestic violence and divorcing families. He completed his mediation and conflict resolution training through Northwestern University, and he opened up C.E.L and Associates in 2005. Brian, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Hirsch. Thank you for having me.
I have to ask you, I looked at your website a little bit. The C and the E are your kids. Who is the L?
The L is a family member.
Family member, wonderful. So I love that you bring your family to work, because everything really is about family. And even when we break up a family through a divorce, we are still family because we have kids and we have connections that go beyond a piece of paper that divides us in some ways. Can you share a little bit more about your background so people understand where your passion and your drive come from? And I have to ask you, why the divorce area?
A lot of people ask me that question. So my background is working with high conflict families in the courts, helping them with parenting agreements, working out situations when there were domestic violence effects, convictions, things like that. As part of helping them, some of them would get divorced. And I learned really quickly that clients that I was helping, when they were done with me and going to attorneys, a lot of the stuff that they had reached agreements on got unraveled through the court system. The attorneys started making positions, and all the things that they nicely reached out in mediation became adversarial. And those agreements went by the wayside and they litigated. And in domestic violence, it's difficult because there's a power imbalance, and a lot of people need those attorneys, but they don't need to fight. So about 17 years ago, I decided to make a switch, left county government, and went into private practice doing divorce mediations and parenting coordinator work. I thought I could do a better job of helping people work their way through the court system. And then when they were done with mediation, refer them to attorneys that I know would not try to blow up the agreements that they reached in mediation. Attorneys that would be there to help the client walk them through the legal process, still be there as an advocate and an attorney for their client, but not try to break up everything they've agreed to just for the sake of breaking it up to make more money.
I love that. I do want to reiterate one quick thing there. You said it so kind of simply and quickly, but I think it's so important to reiterate. You do not have to fight. Yes, we are emotional through a divorce. Yes, there's a lot going on. I say this all the time on this radio show and to my clients, that your emotions can be the most expensive part of your divorce. You really can still go through this without that fight and without all of what you've said with, the positions and the stands and all the rest, and be able to do it in a collaborative way between the two of you. And, when I went through my divorce, I went through a mediation. Admittedly, I was in an emotional fog, so I was not focusing on the technical role and the technique and how the mediator handled themselves. But a few years later, I did go through mediation training as well. And I was astounded at how many misconceptions there are when it comes to mediation. So I'm going to ask if we can kind of start off by just talking a little bit about what is divorce mediation.
Sure. So mediation, divorce mediation is an alternative out-of-court way to help clients reach all the necessary parenting and financial agreements to get divorced without litigation. So, every family is different. Of course, divorce is not emotionless, but in mediation, the agreements they need to reach their business decisions, their children and their finances. I try to help keep the emotions out as much as possible. And as a mediator, I'm a neutral. I work equally for the family. So both of my clients are equally my clients, as are their children. And the whole goal of mediation is to reach good parenting and financial agreements. Parenting agreements that make sense now, all the way through the children graduating college. Financial agreements that are equitable, that are balanced, and that protect both parties going forward. So one person doesn't get taken advantage of during the process and they're in trouble in the future. It's a holistic approach to going through a divorce, which is different than litigation. Litigation is you're pitting each other, people against each other, where mediation is just the opposite. And, half of my job is just educating people as to what the things that are necessary to get divorced mean, because it changes all the time. So it's first going through and saying, okay, here's what this really means in common sense layman's terms, to help break it down to the very simplistic nature of what they need to agree to, and then break the whole process into pieces. If you look at divorce as a whole, it's a lot of stuff, and it clouds people, and they get emotional and angry, sad, mad, all those emotions. But in mediation, mediators try to break it into pieces to make it more manageable. Because some people come in and they're ready to go. Other people, they're very emotional and they're ready to go, but they're still reeling from the breakup of their marriage. So, mediation is about finding that right fit for each client, right, and walking them through the process in a way that works for their family.
And sometimes one party is the one ready to move forward and one is very hesitant and still emotionally. One of the things I will say, when I went through the training, one of the things that really shocked me was, I thought, people go to mediation. The mediator is going to suggest solutions, create those solutions for them. And I think you put it very well on your website, actually, is that your mission is to facilitate conversations among family members during a stressful time in their life. You are not the one creating the solution. They are coming together through your guidance, your facilitation, and being able to actually speak for themselves, which, as you said, sometimes there's an imbalance of power where they've never really had a voice before, and being able to bring that voice out in them becomes so important as well.
Yeah, I found that with the higher conflict and domestic violence mediations, is that ability, like you just said, for someone to be able to speak up is empowering. It makes that person a better parent because they're able to. And now with Zoom, not having to be in the same room with their spouse even is more empowering for people because it makes them feel more comfortable.
That's a great point as well. That imbalance of power can just be created by the presence of somebody there, which, as you said, you could be, 100 miles away now because of Zoom, and that really can level the playing field in so many ways. I do want to come back to kind of some of the misconceptions and preconceived notions, because there's those. What are some that you've kind of seen or experienced that people walk into the office and this is what they're expecting, or that misconception that somebody walks into the office and kind of expects out of mediation?
One big one is that people have to be, happy and cheerful to make mediation work. That if there's any conflict at all, mediation doesn't work. Well, those are the clients that are perfect for mediation. Those that are in conflict, at odds over things, if someone can help them set those differences aside for the betterment of their family, avoid litigation, avoid having their children come into court, those are the perfect people for mediation, because that's where my biggest skill set is helping people in conflict. There are some people getting divorced that they hate each other and there's no civility at all. Those are the most difficult ones, all the way to people that are on the same page, ready to go,
Right.
and everywhere in between. A good mediator works with people at all stages, all emotional states, and helps them wherever they are, to focus on what's important, not what went wrong in their marriage, not why she did this and he did this, but to focus back on the business side of it. And
Right.
that's difficult at times. People are emotional. They say and do things that they shouldn't. So part of my job is just kind of redirecting and reframing, sometimes being a little loud just to get people to stop going down a bad path.
I got to tell you, so being a cold, heartless MBA CPA, right? I'm on the finance side. I could say that. I do kind of look at it sometimes objectively as we are dividing a business, right? If I had a business partner and we decided we don't want to be in business together, we split the assets and we move on. There's a lot of parallel to that. Again, some business partners loved working together, and some really they splitting up because they hate each other at this point. And so I think, firstly, what you've just said is so important, that people need to understand their situation because it's very personal. I think obviously 10 years in the criminal justice system would be a great training ground to be able to experience work with those. And we should never, ever forget many family units have kids. And as important as it is for me or you, whoever is listening, going through a divorce, to make sure that you are okay, and there's a lot of skill sets and people that can help you there, it's equally important to make sure that your children go through the process and they are taken care of. So I'm going to ask you to share a little bit, talk, if you would, about what is a parenting coordinator and the role that a parenting coordinator plays through the divorce process.
Okay. So I always like to say a parenting coordinator is a mediator on steroids. So a parenting coordinator is assigned or appointed or agreed upon on a divorce case, either during a divorce or after a divorce is completed, to work with very high conflict families. So a parenting coordinator's job is ultimately to make legally binding recommendations or decisions for people when they can't. It's a means of keeping people out of court who cannot agree, what day of the week it is, who can't agree on very simple things that most parents can agree upon, even divorced parents, that need that help to get out of the court system. Because the court system in a divorce isn't there to help people. Getting people out of the court system is the most important thing so they can start healing and moving on. And part of the parenting coordinator role is also educating people. A lot of the higher conflict, they just have horrible communication skills. They're still angry about a divorce that happened 10 years ago. So sometimes it's therapy, individual, sometimes it's co-parenting counseling. Part of my job is to try to work myself out of a job as a parenting coordinator. But some people, I'm involved with them up and through their children graduating high school because they know they can't agree. They know if they can't agree, they're going to go to court. So they have me come in to help them on a day-to-day basis, sometimes make decisions and recommendations for them versus, it taking 6 months to work its way through the court system. I can make decisions that day for people. Now, sometimes, of course, one person's not going to like my decision, but my goal is always to look at what's best for their children.
There's so many factors here that are important, and you touched on so many. And unfortunately, from the kids' perspective, I've heard often how sometimes they blame themselves for what's going on because they don't know why it happened, or they might be too young to be able to express themselves. And so part of the reason people get divorced is they cannot communicate well with their spouse, or they haven't been aligned in the same way, and now you are told you have to co-parent your kids, but sometimes from afar because you don't have them with you 100% of the time. And that, makes that challenge that much bigger. And so I think having this intermediary, if I can call it that, often can help because you have an objective sounding board. Sometimes they will agree with you, sometimes they won't agree with you. And I think that in itself is healthy for people to be able to understand, I'm not right 100% of the time, but this is an objective person telling me, as
Yeah.
opposed to somebody that there's a lot of conflict with, which makes a
Yeah.
very big difference.
And most times I know the family. So I
Right.
can make very educated recommendations because of what I know about the family versus a judge sometimes who has just, an hour's worth of information and then has to make a decision,
Right.
which
So
is it's sad.
are there, it is sad. I agree with you. I didn't mean to cut you off there. Are there specific instances where it is required to have a parenting coordinator, or is that really more discretionary?
No, it's discretionary. Sometimes a judge will appoint a parenting coordinator. Most times it's an agreement by the parties and their attorneys to bring a parenting coordinator in. And it all depends on the attorneys. Having a parenting coordinator means less money for the attorneys because it's less litigation. They don't go to court. So there are attorneys out there that don't believe in parenting coordinators because
Right.
it takes money away from them. There's attorneys that I work with that believe in mediation. They believe in parenting coordinators because they don't want to litigate unless they have to.
Right.
It's
And
not let's
just
litigate first, it's litigate last.
right. And a couple things there. When you go through mediation, you have your voice to say no. You go to court, you don't. You present, the other side presents, the judge makes a decision. At that point, it's out of your hands. That's number one.
Yeah.
I just think is important for people to understand. A second part is you've mentioned this a couple times about being neutral, being objective, which are all very important. Sometimes people, and I've had clients that say, "Oh, well, just use the same attorney." You can, but you have to understand that that attorney only represents one of you. They
Yeah.
cannot
Yep.
represent both sides unless you're truly going through a collaborative process,
Yep.
which is a whole different discussion from what we're having today, or
Yep.
discussion of representation. So I
Yep.
think these are all very, very important things that you've been talking about. Having that objective party involved in a not so objective process sometimes,
Yep.
and being able to get to know that family. And that's a huge piece of it, because if you have an attorney that only know your side, they can't always be objective, and their role is not to be objective.
Yep.
And so having someone like this in the process becomes such a positive to get to somewhere in the middle that both sides can live with,
Yep.
and
Yep.
avoid just reiterating this 6 months or 6 years later, right? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. It's. I always tell my clients, I go, you're probably not going to walk out of here with your best case scenario, but you have to be comfortable with the agreement that you reached. You have to be like, you know what? Yeah, I could have got better maybe if I went to court, but I also could have got worse. This is good for my children. This makes sense. I understand what it means today, next month, next year, 5 years, 10 years down the road, and that you can put it behind you.
right.
That you're not, festering because a judge told you what you had to do and you're really mad. And that builds up and builds up, and that affects people's ability to co-parent. Where,
And
in mediation, they're making the decisions. They're their
right.
agreements.
I just got to get on a soapbox here quickly, because so many people talk going through a process. They talk about this co-parenting thing as though it happens after a divorce. When you're married, you co-parent. We don't talk about it as co-parenting, right? But you are co-parenting your kids in the same house.
Yep.
But it talks a little bit to, I think, also what you help people do a lot is look beyond the divorce. When we talk about things like co-parenting beyond the divorce, often people will say, I got to get through this, but we need to keep a
Yeah.
focus beyond the divorce. And that's an important thing. And I'm sure that'll come up in our discussion going forward. But before that, Brian, how can people get in touch with you? Because we're going to have to go to a break after that.
Okay. The easiest way, one of two ways. One is through my website, which is yourdivorce.org. And the second way is via cell phone, which is 312-524-5829.
And I will encourage people. The website has great blogs. It talks about misconceptions. It talks about a lot of great information. And it's a great starting point for you to go and get a feel and what does it look like as we go through this process. And we spoke about misconceptions and preconceived notions earlier, maybe to dispel some of those, because those can hurt you when you walk in with the wrong idea of what's going on.
Yeah.
We will be
big
right. Yeah, so we will be right back after these messages.
and become involved in the family court system, there are no winners. Everybody loses, especially the children. I know, because my custody battle lasted years, was completely unnecessary, and financially devastating. That experience inspired SplitSmart. SplitSmart is designed to empower both parents by giving them the structure they need to stay on course for a more peaceful and respectful co-parenting future. For less than amicable couples, our unique line-item negotiation approach helps soften sometimes emotional stances into child-centered agreements that both parents can live with. Do you want your children to thrive and grow up with healthy, loving relationships with both parents? How much easier would it be if you could bypass the conflict and create a clear, supportive, and comprehensive co-parenting plan and schedule that's tailored specifically for your family? Can you imagine what it would be like if there were no arguments about money or child support? If any of this appeals to you, if you want to minimize the expense and drama of divorce, do yourself and your children a big favor and use SplitSmart to craft your co-parenting and support plans. And as an added benefit, even if you've done your best and still can't get all the way there, SplitSmart will have your information well organized, so a skilled mediator or family lawyer can efficiently help your family cross the finish line. Visit splitsmart.com today to get started on creating a brighter and more joyous tomorrow for you and your kids.
Hello and welcome back to WGSN-DB, the Going Solo Network. And we are talking mediation mechanics and more. And it is really such an important process to understand. A lot of people go through mediation. It has a tremendous amount of benefits. And, you know, creating that objective and neutral environment for somebody can be very empowering, as we spoke about earlier. Our guest today is Brian James with C.E.L. and Associates. I encourage you to reach out, and we have his information on there, as well as we will come back to more about how he actually operates, which I think is always important to understand as well. But before we get into some of that, I want to recap what we have spoken about, because we covered some great points. You know, the first thing is, what is mediation? I think we've spoken a lot about the misconceptions, the preconceived notions. We ended with a little bit of how it can be dangerous walking into such an important process with having those, you know, preconceived notions. So obviously all very important. We spoke a little bit about the parenting coordinator, the role of a parenting coordinator, and how that is very advantageous for your kids, but also creates a playing field that we can play nicely in by having that objective intermediary that comes in and helps. One of the things that I noticed you bringing through a lot as you spoke is also the education that you bring to people. You know, I always talk about how important it is for somebody to pick the right professional. I will tell somebody, you know, I'm very good at what I do, but I may not be the right person for you. Mm-hmm. I think in a process like this that generally is very unfamiliar with and maybe never experienced before, that educational component is so important. So I love that piece that you bring in there, you know. And with that, understanding really that everyone's divorce is a personal experience. They, you know, I will say often, you can live right next door to somebody. They're going to have a similar house, similar kind of car, similar amount of kids and family, and a completely different divorce, right?
Yeah.
What advice would you give someone starting the divorce process?
One is, don't listen to friends and family and coworkers about their divorce. Come in with an open mind. Be willing to compromise and negotiate. Never draw your line in the sand. Ask questions. You know, no question is a bad question. I'm a big believer in, you know, I can explain something 10 different ways if that's what it takes for someone to understand what I'm saying, because everybody processes information differently. Same thing with information. All information is good information. The more I know about my clients, the more I can help ensure that the agreements they're reaching make sense. And also, it's a lot about coming in with kind of a blank slate. Don't start reading tons of stuff online, because some of it's relevant, but a lot of it's not relevant. It could be something that happened in another state, or something that's not relevant to your specific case. That's where, that education piece at the first meeting, I go through and explain everything they have to do, which I think is just the norm. But so many people come to me after they've been in court for a while, realizing that the court system isn't working well for them. And when I explain everything to them, they're like, we didn't even know half of this stuff, which to me, I just don't understand that. Why should they not know everything right up front so they understand what it means?
So this is, you bring up a very, very important piece, because as somebody going through a divorce, you have rights and you have responsibilities. And that's part of this education process, understanding what those rights and what those responsibilities are. And I love how you say kind of being open, and I'm going to use the word being reasonable. Sometimes we are angry. And, I ran into a case, I'm going back a couple of years already, where the spouse was really angry and said, I am, I'm 75% of the time I want the kids. And I was like, wait, don't you travel like 40-50% of the time for your job?
Yep.
Well, how's that 75% going to look, right? That reality testing that you would do in mediation, right?
Yep.
So all of what you said becomes such a key piece going in, because if you are a little flexible, you can have that discussion. You come in rigid, as soon as you break the rigidity, you really change that entire dynamic of what's going on.
And some people are rigid and they don't even know why they're rigid. So, my job is to say, okay, why are you drawing your line in the sand here? And a lot of times it's just a preconceived notions, something that's not really relevant, or something that they were worried about that they don't need to be worried about. And when they draw their line in the sand, I go through and discuss, okay, let's talk the pros and cons of you drawing your line in the sand. Here's what it could happen in court. Here's what it could cost you. How people work together or not together during the divorce process is going to shape how they co-parent going forward. They've already burned bridges to get to the point where they're seeing someone like me. I don't want them burning any more bridges. I want to repair bridges. I want to help them remain or become good co-parents going forward. And if they have a litigious divorce, they're not going to.
Right.
And then they come back to me after the divorce and they blame each other because their kids are starting to have problems, but it's because of the parents that their children are having problems, and all they do is want to blame each other.
So if you had to say, what is the number one thing required for a successful mediation, what would you say that is? And you probably got 20 number ones, so
I'd say come in with an open mind and be willing to negotiate and compromise on every single thing, because I'm going to make sure that your agreement is equitable, that it makes sense. And you may feel like you're compromising so much on everything, but maybe your initial position was a little far outside the norm. So you compromising is really you reaching good agreements, because that's part of my job, is to make sure that overall everything they need to do to get divorced is equitable and balanced, and that it makes sense.
Right.
And that's where some people with their preconceived notions think they're entitled or deserve more than they really do. And that's where that education comes back into, again, so important.
No, I love that. And I do love that education. It's something I think is also so important, and that educational approach as opposed to that clinical approach, especially in such a stressful and such an emotional time, I think is invaluable, quite honestly, as well. So you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. So what is the average time? And again, we know that there's a million scenarios that play into this, but if you had to take an average time, an average cost for a mediation, what would you say that is?
Average time is probably 2 to 3 months. I meet with clients every 1 to 2 weeks, hour and a half, 2 hours at a time, but it really is their pace. Some
Right.
people want to meet every week until they're done. Some people want to meet every month. Cost wise, this is the big one. It all depends on how agreeable they are. How much homework can I give them to do on their own in between the sessions? But the average mediation is somewhere between $2,000 to $2,500 from start to finish.
Right. And just reiterating what you said there, those emotions can be the most expensive part of that divorce that we spoke about earlier, about having responsibilities in this. When your mediator gives you homework, do it, and do it with that openness and receptiveness to being
Yep.
a little bit negotiable, I think, as well. Just a caution, we do have people listening from all over the country. You do want to understand your mediator's approach. That is important, because there are some, and it's taxing sometimes to do it this way, but it's quicker. They may say, let's do it for the day and be done, as opposed to, let's take it in kind of chunks and being able to do that. But that's part of the education process, and understanding what's happening is having that conversation as well.
Yeah. And every mediator is different. I have a certain style, and if someone doesn't like my style, but they like mediation, I'll give them the names of other mediators, because I believe in the process. And some people, the way I work, maybe they don't like it. That's okay to me, because this is their divorce. If
Correct.
You don't like your mediator, you don't like your attorney, you don't like this person, fire them. Don't use them. Go to somebody else. I won't be offended. I'd actually be happy if someone said, hey, Brian, you know what? We're just not connecting well with you. Fine. Mediation. I want you to mediate. Here's some other people that can help you. Please continue with mediation.
Yeah. The last thing that most professionals want is for you to come out disgruntled or unhappy. I mean, realistically, it doesn't seem that way sometimes. And CC, sorry, I'm going to ask you to put that comment back up by Romy, who says, a lot of the arguing and the need for mediation are one parent having to deal with a narcissist. Again, that comes a little bit. Firstly, thank you for listening, and thank you for the comment. Narcissism, is a very difficult thing to deal with. There are strategies, there are professionals who know how to, and there are professionals who don't. So it's part of your education. It's part of your, you've got somebody like Brian right here who says, I spent 10 years in the criminal justice system. I've worked with some of the hardest characters that you can imagine. Many of those are narcissists. There's, they play in there. So again, 100% true on your comment. It comes back to the picking the right professionals for you, which becomes very, very important.
Yeah. And one of those misconceptions with people is they think that once they're divorced, their ex is going to change and be a better person. Well, most people don't change. If you're a narcissist, you're still going to be a narcissist after you're divorced. People want to get through the divorce so fast because they think that's going to be the key.
Right.
Where a lot of times it's not. It actually makes it more difficult because they're going through it so fast, they're not reaching good agreements. And that's going to wind them back up.
Right there.
Yeah. It's finding that right pace for people.
Right.
Important.
And, it speaks to, actually, I've said this probably every other show that I have, but I tell my clients this all the time. This is not the last chapter in this part of your life, which too many people think it is. It's the first chapter in the rest of your life. And we've spoken a little bit earlier about looking beyond the divorce, which is so important. You need to be planning beyond the divorce. So from a professional standpoint, what happens when the mediation's done?
So when mediation is done, so at a last meeting, we will go through what's called a memorandum of understanding. So as the clients are reaching agreements, I'm drafting a document called a memorandum of understanding that spells out and solidifies all the agreements that they've reached. The three of us go through it together, line item by line item, making sure that they understand what everything means, that they know what it means in practicality, today, next month, next year, 5, 10 years down the road. Then once mediation is done, most of my clients, due to financial reasons and just kind of keeping it simple, one person will retain an attorney. The other person will go what they call pro se, or without an attorney. And that attorney will draft up the legal documents necessary for them to get divorced and walk them through the legal side. So they both don't, it's like people think we can have the same attorney, like you mentioned earlier. Well, you can't have the same attorney. An attorney can't represent both of you. That's a big conflict.
Right.
But attorneys that I work with and I trust, they're not going to try to get them to fight. They're not going to try to talk their client out of an agreement. They are going to talk to their clients about the pros and cons. I want attorneys to educate their clients on the pros, but also the cons of what they've agreed to. If you don't agree to this, this could happen in court. This is what it could cost you. Kind of the same things I'm doing with them. And the other person goes without an attorney, because if I've done my job properly, they understand everything. They know what it means. They're content with it. It makes sense for them. It's good for their children. It's good for them. They could always go to court and get better. They could also go to court and get worse. Like you said, you don't want someone else deciding what happens with your children, what happens with your assets, what happens with this, because you're the family. They're your children. It's your money. You have to live this. It's better that you reach agreements versus someone else telling you what you have to do.
I agree with everything you said. And, something just for people to understand as well, the settlement agreement, whether it's called your marriage settlement agreement, a dissolution agreement, different states call it different things. Yeah. You're also going to have a parenting plan. They may be kind of the same document, so to speak, physically, but they really are two different agreements that you're coming to in many ways. But between the two, there's could be 50 or 60 pages, and much of it is going to spell out your long-term activities, meaning, well, when do we drop off the kids? It's Sunday at 6, or, maintenance, which used to be called alimony, things like that. When is it paid? How much is it? Things like that, that are, I would call long-term activities. There are also, and this is the part I think so many people forget about once they sign that document, there are short-term activities that need to happen as well. They have a limited period of time. For example, executing a quadro, which generally deals with retirement money, or, and here's a big one, refinancing your house. If you don't do it in the way that the document spells out, you could lose keeping the house and it could be forced into sale. So I always recommend that people put a checklist together. It's actually one of the services I do, which I think is very, very helpful. It lays out exactly when you need to do what. It takes these 50 or 60 pages and it distills it down into a checklist of to-dos that you know what's going to happen when, so you don't miss any. And some people go like, oh, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal because you've just signed a contract. And this is a contract that can be put in a court case and said they're out of contract, they've breached contract. And so I think sometimes people don't really always understand that either.
Yep, they think the day they sign on the dotted line, that's it.
Yes.
And sometimes I work with people, after the divorce who didn't do something they were supposed to do after the divorce, and now there's problems. Like they never got the quadro entered. They didn't do the refinance, and now rates are super high, or the value of the house has gone down. And they're coming back kind of complaining, but there's nothing you can do because they already agreed, 3 years ago what they were supposed to do and never implemented. So that checklist is so important. It just, so many people just forget about things, which is normal. I mean, it's emotional. A day of a divorce and they just forget things. We're having that check. Having someone that can help them is so important.
I'll give you an exact example without obviously the sensitive data, but they had a quadro. It was supposed to be executed within 75 days of signing. It was about a year and a half later. They hadn't. The market actually that year did about 18 or 19%, which is a significant amount, especially when you're talking $600,000 to $700,000.
Yeah.
And there was nowhere in the agreement that said what will happen with the growth of that money. The quadro was supposed to happen in 75 days, which is not a lot of time. You would think it doesn't really make much of a difference up or down. Yeah. Well, a year and a half later, it really did. Now they were back fighting over the growth of that money because they hadn't executed on the contract. So it's real and it happens. So be careful.
And it's going to hurt one person. It's always going to hurt one person by not doing the things that are in there.
Exactly.
And that's what's sad. Yep.
Exactly. I think people have a pretty good feel of how you work with them, that you educate them, that you bring them in the very first session is a lot of education with that. What do you, I'm going to ask you to talk, because we don't have a lot of time, but I think there's a lot of things that you do that are wonderful. You're volunteering. You cover 3 states. You're in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. I do want people to know that. They can reach out. But can you talk a little bit about how you work with people, setting expectations, closing out a case, things like that, so people kind of understand some of that as well?
So my focus, again, from a legal perspective, my job is to get them divorced, to work on the black and white. Here's the agreements you need to reach. But there's so much to a divorce. There's much more than that. There's the emotions. Maybe their children are having problems. It's to try to help them in all aspects of it, more than just the black and white legal stuff that needs to be done, to try to set them up in a path that they don't have to see me again. It's one of the things I always tell my clients. My best clients are the ones I never see again back in my office after the divorce, because I've helped them put together a good agreement that is solid, that is their agreement. I've hopefully helped them maintain being co-parents or help them become co-parents. So when they have an issue, they can resolve it.
Right.
It sounds weird to say I don't want repeat business, but I don't want repeat business. It's weird to say that, but it's true.
I think that comes to the passion that we spoke about in the beginning, the passion behind why you do what you do. And it's not the paycheck, it's the being able to educate people, to help them to change their lives in a positive way. And that's, I think, just a very noble calling, which is a wonderful thing. And I recommend people learn more about that, obviously. We do have to start wrapping this up, but I'm going to ask, before we do, where should, again, you said this earlier, where should people reach out to you, or how do they reach out to you to connect with you, to learn more?
The easiest way is through my website at yourdivorce.org, or you can call me at 312-524-5829.
Brian, I cannot thank you enough. This has been, I think, one of the best sessions I've had on mediation, for sure. It's really brought such a different perspective, I think, for people to look at mediation, because they hear the word, they don't understand what it means. And hopefully it's brought a comfort for people to say, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot I can retain, a lot of the power that I need to make life decisions, which is just such an important thing. I do encourage you to please reach out to Brian. Again, go to his website as well. There's a tremendous amount of positive information out there. yourdivorce.org. After all, you kind of only get one chance of going through this, and you should make the most of it. I am Hirsch Serman, your host for the Financial Wellness Hour. Please reach out to me through my website, lifecycle.financial. That's lifecycle.financial. You can reach out to me for questions for me. If you miss Brian's information, I will gladly share that with you, and reach out through lifecycle.financial to get it. I want to thank C.C. Schatz, my producer, for doing everything behind the scenes, making this conversation just an easy thing to speak with Brian, learn, and help you guys out there as you go through your journey. I look forward to you joining me on my next show. Have a great week, and thank you so much.